Thanks for welcoming us here at Bowman Park.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's a terrific enterprise, and you can fill us in a little bit about that shortly. Firstly, look, my name's Neil Moss. I'm from Scibus. I'm a veterinarian and a nutritionist and agricultural consultant, and I work with dairy farms all through New South Wales and interstate on a whole range of issues with a big focus, I guess, on nutrition and feeding and getting the most out of our dairy cows. And I guess, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of great extension in the space around pasture and pasture management, but I guess increasingly, as our farms sort of move towards higher stocking rates, they've done a lot of great work in pasture. It's really important for us to focus on the other big part of the feeding equation on a lot of farms, which is grain. So, this is a really interesting year for grain. There's a few issues in industry that we need to talk about. But I thought, look, today let's get together with Tom on farm and have a little look at how they're managing the grain feeding here at Bowman Park and hear a little bit about what you're doing with grain. And we'll talk about that and maybe talk about a few of the trips and tricks and some of the traps that we're sort of seeing around the place this year with the grains and the grains market as we're heading forward.
Thanks, Neil. Lovely to have you back. I guess from the top, I'm a fourth generation dairy farmer. We're a family owned and run operation as well as employing several staff, milking approximately 450 cows year round. We are predominantly pasture fed system, TMR at the moment due to the weather situations and the scenario and being in the transitional period of the year. We often do go into a TMR scenario, and part of that mixed ration is we have a fairly regular reliant on grain as a factor of the cow's diet going into the dairy. So yeah, we're standing in our grain shed at the moment, and we've had a mill in place for I guess it's probably 15 years or so now, and it's served us very well. We are feeding straight barley grain as a part of a mixed ration with other minerals and stuff as well, but yeah, at the moment it is just barley going into their diet, and I guess, yeah, we need to talk about where we're going to go and in projections and how we're going to go forward and attack the market, as well as at the same time making sure that the cows are sufficiently fed.
Excellent, Tom. No, look, and I think, we've had some challenging times, I guess, with the weather, and we are in that transition season where we're moving from our summer feed base into our winter feed base. It's often a time where we're short of grain, or short of total feed and total nutrient, and grain becomes a really important part of that. And I guess we need to add that, with the wagon, we can feed some grain out through the wagon when we want to, but we're also adding to the wagon our protein sources coming in through there. That can come into the dairy if we want, but we can also add, and there's some canola meal being fed here as well at the moment, as well as some minerals and some buffers and some other, bits and pieces to help optimise the performance from the cows. I guess, Tom, barley, it's been a really interesting year this year, and I guess it's been, a huge harvest around the place, but it certainly has been a very challenging harvest. And I guess this is one of the things that we've had to work with a lot of our clients to sort of say, well, plenty of grain out there, all sorts of pricing all over the place, but there's a bit more to it than just buying the cheapest grain, isn't there, Tom?
Absolutely, yeah, most certainly. And quite often, I mean, there's been loads which have showed up here, and yes, the price was right, but as it comes out of the truck, you may not always be happy with what you're seeing. So things like that, keeping on top of quality are crucial.
And look, I think the quality aspects are really, really important, and I guess there's some really basic things that we should be looking at with respect to grain from a day-to-day quality basis. Some of these are physical attributes, but others are also, what's the chemical composition of the grain? Because at the end of the day, the thing we're trying to chase from our grain is starch. That's the thing it brings uniquely to our diet that complements the proteins in our pastures or some of the lower energy forages that we may be feeding. So I guess starch content and the amount of starch in that grain becomes a really important factor for us. And I guess we've got a few proxies for that we can look at on farm. I think there's very little that actually substitutes a good proper run feed test. And I guess we'd advocate generally that the grain is feed tested, because sometimes it can give us some surprises. And what may physically not look like great grain can actually test a lot better. But there's some simple stuff on farm that I think we can do, when grain arrives or when we're talking to our suppliers to sort of specify, well, what is it that we're really, really after? And I guess the first thing when we look at grain that we talk about is probably test weight. Okay, test weight is an indication of the density of the grain. And in general, not always, but in general, as that density of grain increases, as that test weight gets higher, it becomes a starchier product, and the proportion of starch compared to the proportion of fibre outside the grain, improves. Right? So what we're after generally is good, heavy test weight barley. Now, normally there's specifications for that. So the standard, I think, for Australian F1 or feed grade 1 barley is about 62.5 kilograms per hectolitre. Okay, and we can get that calculated on farm. There's some specific weighing equipment, but there's some stuff that we can do quite simply and quite quickly on farm as well. When a sample turns up, to test that if we just want to validate what we think we're actually getting, or if we bought stuff untested and we just want to see where that sits. Okay, so we could probably have a look at maybe doing a quick example of how we do that right now, if you like, Tom.
Yep.
And it's great because you've got a set of scales here, and I think it's one of the really important things to have at most farms is a good, accurate set of scales.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you use this for weighing all sorts of things as you're mixing your feeds?
Mixing and seed weighing and just and just cross-checking things fairly regularly. So
beautiful, yeah, because some of that stuff is quite dose dependent, and we need to be quite accurate with it, particularly some of our additives like luminescent or yeast or those sort of things. We need to be pretty accurate with how we're feeding those. But look, one of the ways that we can set up a proxy for test weighing that's quite simple is to get just basically a good 1 litre measuring jug. Okay, and look, we've got this sample of grain here, which has been conveniently measured out earlier, but it's very close, I think, to a litre of grain. Okay, and then what we want to do with that is just basically weigh that sample. Okay, now you may be saying, he's probably made a bit of an error here. What would that error be? Because it's a very common one. It's one I've actually done deliberately, is we actually haven't paired it first. So if we just went and did that, we'd actually be weighing our grain sample and our bucket. So I'll just take that out again, all right? And what we're going to do is we're going to put that on there, and we're going to zero it and tear it, right? And we'll go again, and we'll have a little look. Here we'll get our grain. And again, you can do this in other multiples. If you've got a ½ litre jug, we just multiply it by 2. If you've got a litre jug, well, then that's fine. And again, we need to get that nicely squared off with our litre mark here. Okay, and again, it's not perfect, okay, but it's very, very close. Okay, and we're going to pop that on there. And we can see here that that's at a test weight of about 61.7, okay, or there'll be about 617 grams per litre. That's going to be about the same as a 61.7 test weight grain. Yep. So that's going to be, look, just below the F1 spec at the moment. But I guess what we're seeing this year is there is a lot of very light barley, and a lot of it's actually coming in the 50s, and getting stuff much over the 61, 62 is very difficult this year, okay? Normally we'd be seeing a lot of barley come in 65, 66, 68, all right? But again, that's a bit hard to find this year. Yep. So, I'm reasonably happy, with that grain. And it's true to what you bought, okay? So, this is the spec that you've ordered, this is the spec that you've got. Yep. So I guess there's a few other things that we need to look at. I think it's quite important just to firstly, examine the colour of the grain. Okay, and this year, I guess what we can see is that a lot of the grain has got a little bit of a grey stain on it. Okay. And that's probably just from some water damage in the head. Because we know that we had a very wet harvest. Yeah. It's quite a testimony to our grain farmers that we actually get a lot of the grain off this year, and the header drivers, and I think there's been a few bogged headers out there this year. So, it's great that we've got it. But what you can see, the main sort of blemish in this grain is this little bit of grey stain. And I guess I wouldn't be super worried about that at the practical level. Yep. If we wanted to, you could send that off for some mould and mycotoxin testing, okay? But generally we find with just this grey stain that's not a huge issue. Yep. Now, if we were seeing, a couple of things that we need to look out for is if we're seeing, lots of discoloured grain, so that might be pink discoloration or, grey, obvious signs of mould. Yep. And the other thing that we can often see are just actual black grains that are just full ergots in there. If we're seeing those, then we've got a little bit more to be worried about, okay? And we certainly want to send that off for testing. And we generally say that if you're seeing little black bodies in the grain, and again, there'll be a few photos there that we can refer to, if we're seeing those sort of bodies in the grain, then we need to have a pretty serious chat to our supplier, because they can have some significant impacts on animal health as we're moving forward. Yep. I guess the next thing that we really want to look at, Tom, is the evenness and size of the grain. Yep. When we have these seasons like we've had out west, quite often we can get a lot of unevenness up through the seed head of the size of grain, and a lot of small pinch grain or screenings in amongst the big grain. Yep. Now again, the nice thing here is that we've got quite an even grain sample. It's very, very large, quite plump in size. And I guess that has a lot of benefits that you won't pick up on a feed test, because it's not just the feed test that's important. The other thing that's important is how that grain physically handles in your processing equipment. Yeah, sure. Now, the nice thing about an even fat grain like that is that that's going to go pretty well through most processing units. You guys have got the disc mill, which
Yep.
we'll have a bit of a look at later. Okay, and the disc mills are excellent because they can process uneven grain very, very well.
Yeah.
Right, but a lot of farms will have roller mills on them, and the roller mills, it's quite important when you're using a roller mill that we have a very even sized grain if possible. Okay, because then we can set those rollers so that they come together at one length, and that gets all the grain that comes through. Because if we have lots of pinched or uneven grain, or small grain, you'll start seeing that small grain come through the cow in the manure, and the farmers will get increasingly frustrated, and rightly so, that they're feeding a lot of bypass grain, which is sort of, not particularly good utilisation of that starch. So they'll keep grinding it down and tightening and tightening and tightening till they get to the point where they're turning the grain into flour,
Yep.
which has got other problems, just to get those last few grains. Fantastic, Tom. Well, I think you guys have done a great job getting the grain here.
Yep.
You've got the gear to process it,
Yep.
and you're doing a really nice job. But let's actually have a look at the physical product that you guys are producing for the cows.
Yeah, sure.
So, mate, thanks for grabbing this earlier. But it's excellent to see here. This is the finished product that the cows are eating in the dairy. And I guess when we're assessing grain and how well it's been processed, there's a few things that we need to look at, because it's always a difficult balance between under and over processing. If we over process or grind it too hard, that can be problematic because the starch can be too readily available. That can have impacts on things like butterfat production and risk of acidosis. But again, if we don't process it enough, okay, a lot of that grain will just go straight through the cow, and it's basically unavailable.
Yep.
And again, we talked about those issues with pinch grain, and you don't seem to have a lot of that. But even if we did, the disc mill is probably going to deal with that. So if we just have a little look, we go through here and we just branch that out. And I guess what I like to look for in the grain, okay, and there's two places where we can look at that. I look at it here first, but then I also go out and look at the manure. Okay, and it's quite important to look at the manure, because in the manure we can see examples of where that grain's going straight through.
Yep.
Okay, we can pick it up and have a bit of a squeeze, see if there's still much starch in it, see if the shell's been cracked or not. Okay, but if we come back here and we have a look at your grain, really, if I pick it all up, I'm really struggling to find any whole grains at all. Okay, so the disc mill is just doing a stunning job here for you. Okay, and there's a number of mills that are starting to emerge that'll work similarly to the discs. They're not the only one in the market these days, but they were sort of the leader in this changeover from roller mill.
Yep.
And I think it's hugely improved our starch utilisation on farm and our ability to handle grain that may be suboptimal as well as good grain.
Yeah, okay.
But really, if I look at that, it's not under-processed, it's not over-processed. We like a mix of finer particles, some coarser particles which are a bit slower to break down in the rumen. And this is spot on at the moment. Okay, so really, really happy with that. And we can see some other bits of mineral in here, and obviously you've got some other bits and pieces in there as well.
Yep.
So really happy with that. Occasionally, if we've got a bit of dust occur in the dairy, there's some things we can do to suppress that.
Yeah.
Okay, we can look at adding some things like molifos. Okay, potentially oils, as long as they've been appropriately treated and come from a registered processing centre.
Yep.
But look, I think all in all, that's really, really good. So I guess, Tom, what other questions have you got about the grain at the moment?
Well, I think given the fact that there has been a harvest which has been healthy, but also, created a variety of quality of grain, I think just those things to look out for before the grain gets here.
Yep.
And then also monitoring the price of the grain, and then maybe even looking towards doing a mixture of different types of grain and stuff like that, which can help benefit long term and also be cost effective at the same time.
No, terrific. And look, there's a couple of good questions, and I guess one thing that we should also reflect on is that every load of grain may be a bit different.
Yep.
What's really important is that you're backing that up by actually recalibrating your feeding in the dairy.
Yep.
Because if this comes in at a heavier test weight or a lighter test weight, okay, that might vary by 10%.
Yep.
20% if you've changed grains, for example, from corn to barley.
Yep.
All our feeding systems are calibrated by time, not by weight. Okay, so we might think we're feeding 6 kilos a day. We could be feeding 8, or we could be feeding 4.
Yep.
Okay, and that can have a huge impact both on the diet and the performance, but also on our budgeting and the weight rate we're going through grain. I guess looking over the horizon, there's a few challenges that we need to be realistic about. We're in a pretty volatile situation internationally at the moment. And I think, while there's good supplies of grain out there, it wouldn't be unwise, if you find a good supply of high quality grain that you're happy with and your price is at a price where you're comfortable trading, taking some sort of contract position on that this year would probably make sense. It gives us something with some certainty.
Yep.
I guess the other thing is, what grains might we change to look forward to? I guess we're just starting to see the front end of maize come off. And again, one of the great things up here in the north is that it's not a long way over there in the Liverpool Plains, very accessible to the Hunter Valley, but also the coast. And our guys even further north, they can pick it up from those northern production regions, particularly those that haven't been hit by some of these summer floods. It's been quite a good season out there, and a lot of corn's going to come off. You fed a bit of corn last year, Tom.
Yeah.
How did that go?
Yeah, it was probably about this time last year that we sort of made that.
It's when we were coming onto a lot of ryegrass and having a few challenges with butterfat, wasn't it?
Yeah, challenges with butterfat and my grass utilisation wasn't correct either. So on the back of our floods last year, we upped the grain percentage to a fairly high amount. It was around that 12 kilo mark just to help to get us through. And then on the transition, then once we had grass available, it became pretty apparent that what they're getting wasn't correct and we had butterfat issues, and the corn came in a big way to help rectify that. And I think, we saw a really nice percentage in a positive shift. And I think we were looking at around a net transfer in a positive direction of almost $1,000 a week, which was hugely beneficial to the farm.
Oh, it'd be hugely beneficial to the business. And I guess the interesting thing to reflect on was that corn was more expensive.
Yes.
So we were paying more for that grain.
Yes.
But the net benefit on the milk components and the litres produced, and the fact that we could also pull grain back, all of those things combined to put us in a much better position financially by utilising corn. I mean, corn's a fantastic grain if we can use it and handle it. It's got a much slower degradation rate in the rumen.
Yep.
Okay, so when we're pairing that with just feeding, say, twice a day and then going out into the paddock, corn is part of that rationale. In your situation, we went to 100% corn. Just gives a much smoother supply of carbohydrate to the rumen bugs that are chewing up all that protein and other goodies in the grass.
Yep.
And it just stabilises that rumen environment, so we get a much smoother fermentation, and it feeds very directly into some of our production outcomes and our health outcomes as well.
Absolutely.
So we'd be looking to probably do that once the ryegrass starts. I
think definitely. And the reality is, Neil, that one of the only reasons that we don't have it now is just the availability isn't quite there yet. As due to the moisture levels around, I think they've sort of held off a little bit, but it's got to be any week that we're going to see some new season come on the market.
Excellent. All right. Terrific. All right. Well, look, that's a good summary, I guess, today of some of the grain issues that we're facing and a few of our considerations on farm. We've got to think quality, weight. Does it suit our processing system, particularly if we've got uneven grains? How are we going with our processing? How does that fit in with, again, our production objectives? And do we need to be looking at other options with respect to grain type, as we move from a different feed type and those grains become available? Thank you.